Chapter 13, Revelations 4:4. Chapter 7, Revelations 4:4, 1993, 1994. Percy is 17 and 30, Harry is 13, Ginny is 12, Tom is still 16, and Sirius Black and Severus Snape are 33. February 1993. In early February, Pettigrew disappears. Ron storms into the common room, his face blotchy and red. Hermione follows close behind, clutching Crookshanks protectively. Percy winces, anticipating an explosion. He caps his ink bottle and casts a quick wandless drying charm on his arithmancy assignment, just in case he needs to jump into the fray. "My cat didn't touch your rat," Hermione insists, her bushy hair crackling as her magic sparks around the curls. Percy eyes it appreciatively. He's always felt that Hermione was likely more magically powerful than she realizes, given that she prefers to study magic rather than practice it. "And even if he did, that's what cats do, Ron. It's not my fault you let your rat run free. You let Crookshanks run free," Ron responds obstinately, turning on her. "Why should a cat be free but a rat has to stay locked up? Why can't Crookshanks have a cage while Scabbers runs free around the castle?" This is actually a somewhat valid point, and it makes Percy's lips twitch. He bends his head over his parchment to hide his amusement, though he does not yet unscrew his ink. The timeline appears to be progressing right on schedule, despite Percy's meddling. Percy can vividly remember how upset he was at Ron, the first time, when his younger sibling had admitted that he'd gone and lost Percy's old pet despite receiving strict and careful instructions on how to best care for the rat. After the trio brushes by, Hermione storming angrily up the stairs after Harry fails to make peace between his two friends, Percy unobtrusively stands and slips out of the room. He's going to keep the timeline as is. He is. He's not stupid. He knows that the one constant they must rely on is the fact that the shade of Voldemort that is twisting its way through the world manages to solidify into a body which can be killed. He does want to know more about what Pettigrew is up to, skulking around Hogwarts. It is not impossible for someone to walk off the grounds of Hogwarts, though it is significantly harder for someone to walk on. Nothing is keeping Pettigrew here, or rather, something must be keeping Pettigrew here. When he's outside, he picks a quiet spot to first cast a few point-me spells, which inform him that both Pettigrew and Black seem to be around the edges of the castle. With a stretch of his muscles, he turns on his heel to transform into the lynx. When he had first envisioned becoming an animagus, he had believed he would spend every bit of free time exploring his new animal form. The reality is much less glamorous. To begin, Percy hardly has any free time. Furthermore, it is not as if his form is small and easy to conceal in the castle. What is he supposed to do as an animal, anyway? Percy cannot help but feel embarrassed every time he transforms and goes for a run across the grounds. It seems childish, in a way, to indulge his desire to sprint around and bat at the butterflies and roll around in the grass, and he'd hate to be caught doing it. He judges that neither Pettigrew nor Black are likely up to date on their knowledge of the forest's creatures, however, and so he meanders his way across the grounds, secure in the padding of his four paws. Being a lynx is rather relaxing. His human problems seem just a tad remote, just a centimeter out of reach. He smells Pettigrew hiding in the pumpkin patch, his nose wrinkling as it confronts a range of unfamiliar scents. Smelling is one thing he does not enjoy in animal form. Hagrid is, once again, implausibly growing massive crops, despite the blustery chill of the February day. If Percy's mother ever saw Hagrid's vegetable garden, she'd be after him for weeks, trying to learn his secrets. This weekend, for instance, the patch behind Hagrid's hut is filled to the brim with large orange and red pumpkins, several vines of what looks to be English peas, and big watermelons with glossy green skin. Percy stops to sniff at the watermelons. He is a boy from a farm, after all. He can recognize good gardening when he sees it, and the lynx has less of an aversion to the grubs that may be nestled in the watermelon patch than his human form. He is gratified to note that there is no hippogriff chained to the side of the patch. Looks like his advice to Draco paid off. After Draco dropped the class, there would be no real need for his father to continue his investigation into Hagrid. Percy is privately skeptical over Hagrid's ability to run a clean operation, but he does remember the drama of that slaughtered hippogriff, and he is glad to see it avoided. Percy catches a whiff of fear from Pettigrew as he trots by, so he veers further afield. Percy had been careful not to transform around Pettigrew, but he does not want to get too close to the rat let him be scared, hiding out in Hagrid's pumpkin patch. Not too scared. He does not want Pettigrew to flee. Percy whines to himself and noses at a large curling vine on the edge of the forest as he thinks about Pettigrew. Clearly, the man is more scared of what is outside the wards, not within. Maybe he believes Black will pounce on him the second he leaves the wards, but clearly Black can get inside the wards. In fact, Percy sniffs the air thoughtfully. There is a mangy dog smell rather close by. The point me had suggested Black was in this direction, but so close to Pettigrew. As Percy meanders his way toward the dog smell, trying to take a circuitous route as if he were merely exploring, he wonders if the other man can smell Pettigrew. Perhaps Black knows exactly where Pettigrew is and is waiting for something. Perhaps Lupin is in on the whole plan. In the middle of a small clearing, Percy spots a large, skinny dog curled up in a patch of sun. Black, if that who the dog is gaunt, his ribs showing through the dark pelt of his animagus form. He looks up when Percy enters the clearing, but does not engage, though he shifts his body protectively over the bone that he is gnawing on. Percy feels a bit of disgust. Imagine the heir to the Black family reduced to such indignity. It is not as if Gringotts would not allow him to order by owl. Goblins are famously neutral in most wizard affairs, the Second Wizarding War notwithstanding. Percy would be willing to bet that if Black wanted to, he could withdraw enough money to outfit him properly, perhaps in Hogsmeade under a false name. Percy understands wanting to avoid detection, but a man like Sirius Black should be able to evade the Ministry's inept. Yes, he can admit it, inept. Attempts at capture with a few identity-concealing spells or potions. A man that can achieve the animagus form would certainly be capable of changing his face to anonymity. Black must be mad. Percy settles himself beneath a tree, curling up to watch Black, one animal to another. Black is mad. A second later, Black transforms and lunges for Percy, who is only able to escape due to his enhanced animal reflexes. He does not transform, choosing instead to growl at Black in lynx form. "Come here, kitty," Black says, completely inaccurately. He looks even worse as a person, his hair thick and matted, his clothes torn. Percy whines in distress, and it is only partially due to the precarious position he finds himself in. Maybe Black does not know about mail order. Impossible. Does he not have a secret, unplottable ancestral home that should, at bare minimum, contain a kitchen and a shower? "You're one of the smart kiddies, I can tell," Black croons, holding out his hand. Percy would furrow his brows if his lynx form allowed it. "You want to help me, don't you, kitty?" Even if Percy were a cat, how could he possibly help this shell of a man? "Can you bring me food, kitty? Can you bring me some fish or meat? I know you can understand me. You're one of the smart ones. Are you a Kneasel, little kitty?" Percy bristles at the indignity of being called little kitty. Lynxes look nothing like Kneasels, pointed ears and whiskers aside. It was as if Black was calling a lion or a tiger a common house cat. Simply unforgivable. But Percy supposes he could bring Black some food. He does not like the crazed look in his eye, the way he carries himself as if mental strength were the only thing preventing total collapse. For Merlin's sake, his wand is dangling from one hand. Black is choosing to live like an utter madman. No adult wizard should ever look like this, even a wizard on the run. Percy backs away slowly. Black sighs, looking sad, and then sits cross-legged on the floor, looking oddly childlike. "Well, if you do get some food, bring it back here," he mumbles, clearly losing interest in Percy. He stares at his own hands instead. "Maybe when I kill him, I'll starve him to death slowly. See how he likes it, the filthy little rat. I'll keep him in a cage and watch him wither and die." Percy turns tail and runs until he is back toward the castle. Panting, he transforms back into a human. Luckily, as he practiced, his wand and clothes shift with him, though he'd cast a disillusionment charm just in case. What is Black's plan? Clearly to kill Pettigrew. Clearly the man hasn't yet found the rat. How? Why not? Percy had not had any problem finding both of them. Perhaps Black's magic no longer works after being in Azkaban. And if that were the case, what brings the two together in a tangle alongside Harry and Ron, just a few months away? Is it just luck? Luck is the enemy of the time traveler, as anyone studied in the art would be able to attest to personally. It very well may be that Percy needs to create a situation where Pettigrew and Black cross paths, but also Ron and Harry and Hermione. Not to mention, Pettigrew needs to escape, alive, as does Black. Percy tries exactly once to tail Lupin around the castle. The other man catches him in an instant and keeps him under wand point until he sheepishly transforms back into his human form. Damn werewolves and their enhanced senses. Percy stutters some excuse about practicing subterfuge. An odd expression of fondness crosses Lupin's face. Aimed, Percy is sure, at some ghost of the past, and the defense professor lets him go without any points lost. Still, it is overall an embarrassing encounter. Snape, too, seems very interested in the unknown series of events that catapult the wizarding world into the next war. It seems as though what is important is Pettigrew flees to the Dark Lord, Snape says, for what may be the 10th time. He taps a quill slowly across his lower lip, an oddly intimate gesture that Percy notices he slips into when he seems to be lost in thought. Black and the children, they are merely bystanders. But something must make Pettigrew flee, and be mad enough to seek out the Dark Lord, Percy insists, also for the 10th time. Snape shakes his head. We cannot rely on that. If we are off by a single day, if Pettigrew makes one single decision differently, if we fail to scare him sufficiently, I fear he will never think to traverse that far. We do not know if he found the Dark Lord by chance or on purpose, nor what was necessary for him to resurrect him. I knew Pettigrew in school. That kind of advanced magic would be far out of his grasp. Likely he had an accomplice. Percy frowns hesitantly. What are you suggesting, then? Imperious, of course, Snape says coolly, raising his eyes to meet Percy's. Your little diary still hasn't awoken, has it? Face it, Mr. Weasley. You may have engineered the destruction of one or even two Horcruxes. My congratulations, of course, but our task is hardly finished. Percy purses his lips obstinately, but does not engage. I worry the Dark Lord, when he does return, will easily detect the Imperious and wonder at it. Snape inclines his head slightly, the only indication that Percy made a point Snape judged to be of value. Yes, that is why we must use that to our advantage. You want the Dark Lord to discover Pettigrew was cursed. I want the Dark Lord to see it is I who cursed him. Why, oh, Percy says, as it becomes clear. Loyal Death Eater, Severus Snape. Snape smiles thinly. Percy rather suspects it is his turn to forcibly contain himself from engaging in a fruitless argument. Yes, much is contained in that one word, and Percy resists the urge to shiver. I have heard rumors, but I fear I cannot escape Dumbledore's notice myself. When I discover Pettigrew, I take advantage of the situation and compel him to bring back the Dark Lord. That will change the timeline, though. But we risk a fair greater change. We need the Dark Lord to return so that we may destroy him ourselves. Snape and Percy have discussed this at length, but both grudgingly agreed they cannot risk allowing the shade of the Dark Lord to exist, insubstantial as he may be. There is no guarantee he can be destroyed in that form. No, they must lure the Dark Lord back into being and then end each Horcrux in turn. With Harry, Percy points out. Snape gives a haughty sniff. This is a point of contention between the pair. Snape refuses to admit Harry is the chosen one, despite Percy reciting the entirety of the prophecy. Percy would normally agree that divination is a dicey business, not one to stake any lives on or anything. But at the same time, Harry had been fairly adamant that he was required to end the Dark Lord. Snape seems to think that merely existing is sufficient for Harry to fulfill his role, which Percy feels must be incorrect, right? We should wait until June, as your memory serves, Snape says instead. We do not want to risk the Dark Lord returning any earlier than he did before. If we know he will try and launch an attack on the Potter boy during the Triwizard Tournament, then that provides us with an opportunity. He glowers for a prolonged second at Percy, as if Percy, of all people, is going to disagree with him. For Merlin's sake, it was Percy who made that decision, all those years ago, to keep the timeline as intact as possible until this one crucial moment. I will tail Pettigrew using the map, which I will remind you, you have not returned to me after your last pathetic attempt to steal it from me. You keep an eye on the children. We cannot risk a confrontation where we are not present. Agreed, Percy says, dispiritedly digging around for the map. He supposes he could try and make another copy, but he isn't sure that layering yet another anchoring spell would be effective. Not to mention, he hardly has the time. Oh, the halcyon days of his youth, where he could curl up in bed with a personal project. Percy returns from Snape's office to find Gryffindor Tower, once again, milling about in fear. Merlin's beard, he swears to himself. He completely forgotten about Black slashing Ron's bed curtains. Black must not know that Pettigrew is lurking on the grounds. There's no other reason to break into the dormitory, not unless Black is truly after Harry. That Black slashed Ron's curtains, however, does make Percy believe that Pettigrew is his true target. Really, Black is displaying an appalling lack of subtlety or control. He's a bloody animagus, and a wizard with a wand. How hard is it to sniff out one inept rat? Percy watches Henry once again stride to the front of the crowd, struggling to control the panicked whispers springing up on all sides. Despite himself, Percy has to hide a snort, turning away to mask the unpleasant expression he is sure has crossed his face while he watched Henry. Not as easy as it looks, is it? Percy asks silently to Henry, who has begun to raise his voice to keep everyone under control. Percy may never have been particularly popular, but he thinks he ought to be able to say, at least in the privacy of his own mind, that he really had been the better head boy. April 1993, the rest of spring term passes without incident. Percy installs himself close to the young trio, ostensibly for protection, and though Ron makes more than a few pointed comments about Percy's lack of friends, Harry and Hermione are considerably warmer to him. Even Ron lets up after Percy purchases him a set of Keeper's gloves for his birthday. "Why Keeper?" Ron says, running his hands over the butter-soft leather of the luridly orange gloves. If Ron makes the team, he can always spell them to the proper colors. Percy shrugs. Seems as if it would play to your strengths. The trio spends most of their time whispering near the fire. Percy keeps an eye on them, just enough to notice if they try and slip out, but not close enough that it seems as though he is eavesdropping. He does eavesdrop, a little. Mostly they complain about Malfoy and Snape, discuss Sirius Black, speak about Harry's increasingly successful attempts to conjure a Patronus. This last topic never fails to blacken Percy's mood. Soon after Ron's birthday, it is the twins. Percy gives them both artifacts from the Prowett vault. "I know everyone is still rather shirty with me," Percy says, looking at each in turn. "But we are family, and family means we try and preserve our heritage, both our heritages. Aunt Muriel says you two remind her very much of another set of twins, ones tasked with carrying on the Prowett name. She would like it very much if she could tell you about them some time." The twins are uncharacteristically quiet. Easter rolls around, and all the Weasleys elect to stay at Hogwarts. Percy takes the week to prepare for his Newt exams. Though he is enrolled in only 11 classes, he intends to take an even 13 exams. He'd hoped for 14. Part of him wishes churlishly to beat Tom, but he'd not kept up with his divination enough to try. Speaking of divination, Percy has to excuse himself and laugh into his pillow when he hears of Hermione's explosion in that class. The girl has fire, he'll give her that. Percy spends much of spring working with Snape and Myrtle, diving into Horcruxes. He also spends quite a lot of time trying, yet again, to coax Tom awake from the diary. And yet he is convinced Tom is not entirely gone. There is something lurking in the back of his mind, but he does not know where it is. His mind library is pristine, organized, and dare he say, elegant, but there is a lurking darkness. Bookshelves in one's one mind should not cast shadows. Sometimes he wakes in the middle of the night, and his toes feel cold as they were pressed against the castle's damp stone. Sometimes he snaps at his classmates, and the words are not his. Sometimes there is an extra tremor to his fingers when he wraps them around his wand. Sometimes he remembers Tom's challenge to assert himself and feels as though he's disappointed him. Sometimes he tries to cast his Patronus, and the mist is thin and insubstantial. But he has lost no memory, not really. Snape examines his mind and finds nothing. He watches him on the map and assures him he does not leave his dormitory at night. "It's all in your head," says Snape. "We need you to be focused, Mr. Weasley. Stop conjuring ghosts." Is that what he is doing? Giving up the diary as lost had not been particularly easy for Percy, which is perhaps why he becomes fascinated with the diadem, researching its history in great depth, and even sketching it in as much detail as he can. Toward the end of April, he even feels brave enough to suggest to Snape that they should try actually wearing the damn thing. Snape does not even look up from his scribbling. No. The diary is not responding. It likely is destroyed, concedes Percy, though he is not entirely convinced. The diadem is likely dead as well. When Tom and I encountered it, we triggered its awakening merely with touch. It is possible that now we need to interact with it as it expects. Snape sets down his quill and looks tiredly at Percy. And if the diadem is not destroyed, remove it from my person at once, quips Percy. We do not know what other protections Lady Ravenclaw set on the diadem, Snape says, not engaging with Percy's attempt at humor. Everything about the diadem is a mystery. We need to take the risk, Percy protests. It might even give us wisdom. Ah, this is what this is about, Snape drawls insultingly. You wish to be the one who gains wisdom from the diadem. You think you are worthy, Percy Weasley. Percy shakes his head, his ears flaming slightly. No, but I think the Grey Lady will help me. Percy has a faint memory of the Grey Lady, the coolness of her touch, as snow falls around his face and he struggles to breathe. Something about protection, something about a mutual recognition of the other, a shared purpose. I can summon her, Myrtle pipes up from the corner. She looks at Snape's face assessingly. Percy squashes a frisson of irritation that she does not look to him, and then dives through the floor. You may die for this, Snape says conversationally. But since he returns to his writing, Percy does not take that to mean that Snape is as worried as he seems. Percy does not respond. He's frustrated that the diary isn't responding, that Tom has abandoned him. If they are to write off both Horcruxes, then he wishes to be certain. And yes, perhaps he wishes for wisdom, perhaps he hopes to reap a reward for finding the lost diadem of Lady Ravenclaw. Snape never would have the chance to examine it if it were not for Percy. For Tom, Myrtle and the Grey Lady drift through the wall serenely. Myrtle's eyes are wide and childish behind her glasses. Compared to her, the Grey Lady looks impossibly refined. Have you succeeded, young Weasley? The Grey Lady asks, not sparing a look for Snape. Percy fights the urge to sweep a bow, instead levitating the diadem carefully so that it is closer to her line of sight. We believe the Horcrux may be gone. I wish to wear the diadem to see if that triggers action. The Grey Lady arches an eyebrow. And to receive wisdom, I imagine. Snape snorts quietly from behind Percy. Percy ignores it. Will I come to harm if I wear the diadem? The Grey Lady reaches out a ghostly hand and trails it along the jewels adorning the top of the diadem. She closes her eyes, as if she can actually sense the diadem, as if she can exert an influence on the physical world. And why not? Myrtle is adept at bursting pipes. Why would the Grey Lady not be able to interact with her mother's diadem? I believe the diadem itself will not harm you, says the ghost. I cannot speak for what else it may contain. Percy nods, trembling slightly, and reaches out a hand for the diadem. Before he can grasp it, however, Snape hits him with several rapid diagnostic charms and what Percy believes is a strong charm of protection. Data, he says, when Percy looks at him questioningly. We likely will have to risk multiple controlled exposure to the Horcrux, and we do not know how the Horcrux will corrupt or manifest the diadem's true powers. From my research, the diadem merely enhances the wisdom of the wearer. That is to say, it does not necessarily bestow any new intelligence. They look at the Grey Lady, who floats, silently, neither confirming nor denying Snape's theory. I would imagine that this version of Tom was already wise, Percy continues, though he cannot help but feel that his words are a tremendous understatement. I shudder to think what the Horcrux knows. Providing the Horcrux with knowledge about you could be dangerous, and providing knowledge about you would not be, Percy says with a raised eyebrow. Unless we wish to kidnap and obliviate random test subjects, we'll have to eventually take the risk. I'd rather do it earlier rather than later. After a second, in which Percy belatedly worries Snape will suggest kidnapping some random participants in their trial, Snape gives a terse nod. Percy had provided Snape with extensive documentation of the timeline, in addition to some key memories in bottles, though after Snape's relentless interrogations, there is not much that Snape does not yet know. The only secrets Percy still has are of this timeline. It was surprising how cathartic the act of telling Snape everything had been for Percy. Percy takes the diadem gingerly from where it is floating in the air and settles it on his head. It is cool, uncomfortably so, and for a second Percy thinks nothing will happen at all, and then he sees his father twist out of the diadem. But it is not his father as he knows him, stooped and weary and shabby. The mist condensed into a version of his father that is strong and tall, his eyes glittering fiercely behind his glasses. This version of his father looks very much like Percy, and the experience is rather disconcerting. "Son," says his father, and the voice too is just a shade away from real. When the Horcrux does not say anything further, Percy exchanges a confused look with Snape, and then he speaks. "Father, why are you here?" "In truth, I do not know," says Arthur, the formal words odd from his father's mouth. "I had thought once that you would be an heir of whom I could be proud. I know better now." Percy clenches his jaw and then forces himself not to react. "Tom," he tries instead, looking into his father's eyes. "Tom, I want to speak to you." Arthur laughs, and the sound is grating to Percy's ears. "Why would you believe Tom wants to speak to you?" "Tom, I need to speak to you. It's important," pleads Percy. "We both know that these figures, they are but misdirection." "Pathetic," his father breathes. "Why you believe yourself worthy of his attention, of mine, is unfathomable." "Shut up," Percy snaps, his face twisting in anger. "Tom, I want to speak to you now." "Oh, Percy," Arthur breathes pityingly. "You never learn, do you? Least respected, least valued, least important. You are the heir to nothing, my boy, and it would serve you better to learn that quickly." Arthur begins to laugh, and Percy whips out his wand, incensed. A second later he staggers back, the tight feeling in his chest beginning to loosen as Snape levitates the diadem off of his head. Percy doesn't say anything as Snape locks the diadem back in the desk, needing all of the time he can to recover from the intense surge of hatred toward his father that the Horcruxes' words had elicited. The entire encounter had been under a minute or two total. Percy had switched from confusion to anger so quickly that his head had begun to throb with the intensity of his sudden change in disposition. The Grey Lady speaks up quietly. "I believe the diadem will never work again," she says, and the raw loss in her voice is enough to embarrass Percy. "Destroy it, Mr. Weasley. Destroy it now." Snape shakes his head, continuing to examine the diadem. "We do not know how, my lady, but rest assured we will one day," he says smoothly. "We thank you for your assistance." This is a clear dismissal, and the ghost disappears the way she came without another word. A silence follows her departure, the short encounter with the Horcrux leaving them all rattled. The diadem secured, Snape turns to Percy and raises a silent eyebrow, a clear admonishment at Percy's obvious lack of control. Percy flushes angrily. "It wanted to make me angry," he says in his defense. "Do you believe your father is not proud of you?" Snape says. Percy splutters uncomfortably and takes another step back unconsciously. "I'm sorry." "The Horcrux," Snape prompts, as if Percy is being intentionally slow. "It took the form of your father, but a version of your father that is dismissive of you. Is that a fear of yours?" "Of course not." "Weasley, do not mistake my motives in asking this question," snaps Snape, his voice suddenly terse. "I care not for your personal drama, nor your insipid little feelings. We must document each of these encounters. Why did the Horcrux take this form? Why a version of your father much wealthier than the Arthur I know? Why did he speak to you with such disdain?" Myrtle, eyes flicking between the two, slowly and silently fades away. Neither wizard notices her leaving. "I obviously don't care if my father is proud of me," says Percy irritatedly, his voice rising despite himself. "I'm here for one reason, Snape. My father can't hope to understand that. But you want him to. You wish your father was wealthier, more respectable, but you fear that if he was then he would have no interest in you." Percy takes another step back, his hand curling around his wand. Perhaps it is the brush with the Horcrux, or perhaps it is the uncomfortable feeling of having another person focus his insight on him for the first time in nearly a decade. But Percy cannot fight the lick of panic and irritation that is building inside his stomach. He knows Snape is probably right. He knows that he should at least try to analyze what he is feeling, but his chest is tight, and his throat is tight, and he cannot bring himself to calm down. "You're reaching," he says instead. "I have to go." "Mr. Weasley," Snape begins to say, voice raised. "Percy," he says again, and then darts through the door before Snape can stop him. Outside, he takes 2 rapid left turns and then stops against one of the enchanted windows that looks out over the great lake. What is wrong with him? Snape had not even said anything particularly cutting or particularly cruel, but Percy is feeling as if Snape had looked deeply into his soul and seen something too intimate to explain. It's the Horcrux, he tells himself, shaking his head. It makes me feel vulnerable. He'll have to apologize to Snape at some point, he knows. But for this evening, all he can do is set his embarrassment aside for the time being. Percy brings Black a care package the next day, feeling a bit guilty that he'd forgotten about the man in all of the fuss of the last few weeks. Mimsy happily packs him some nutritious food, including several types of fruits and vegetables to hopefully stave off scurvy, and even includes a magical razor and soap without question. He debates as to the method of delivery, but finally just disillusions himself to leave it in the clearing. Even Black would find a lynx pushing a full package of supplies suspicious. Then he does transform into his form, trotting toward the lake as he mulls over his behavior to Snape. Why had the Horcrux wanted to incite anger? Percy would have guessed it would want to slyly invite the wearer in, same as the diary. Perhaps Tom had been more angry when he created it, or he feared an opponent wearing the diadem for too long and gaining wisdom of their own. Perhaps the diadem feeds off of the wearer's anger. He also does not understand why that surge of anger rattled him so. Percy is familiar with anger, he thinks to himself as he trots across the grounds. Why would this be any different? Perhaps it is just that his Tom is dead, or whatever passes for death when one is a Horcrux. Percy knows that Tom becomes undeniably evil, but here, alone in his head, he mourns the boy that he improbably got to know over the last 2 years. The abrupt conclusion to his relationship with Tom is jarring, to say the least, and he wishes he would have known what Tom's reaction would be to the other Horcrux. It is interesting to think that the Horcruxes would want to destroy each other. Admittedly, his sample size is 2, but Percy wonders if each Horcrux represents a different part of his soul. The diary, by definition, is Tom at his most intimate, its pages nothing more than a schoolboy wishing to remain forever at school. The diadem could be wisdom. Certainly the shadowy figures of Dumbledore and Fred were knowledgeable, if not wise. But is it because of the age that Tom was when he created the Horcrux? Perhaps like ghosts, the portion of the soul ripped from the whole is frozen at that point in time, never to develop further. Or is it the medium? Had the Horcrux merely corrupted the powers of the diadem? Percy knows from his research that the cup provides unlimited or magic sustenance, depending on the legend. The locket is an amulet of protection. The sword is an instrument of destruction. What would they look like, corrupted by the Horcrux? He whines to himself and breaks into a run, his 4 legs bounding in harmony across the grounds. His chest burns with the exertion, but whereas exercising in his human form makes him feel weak, the effort of maintaining his place makes him feel strong in this form. His actions killed Tom that night and removed their best chance for success at the same time. How are they meant to communicate with the diadem when it seems to communicate through taunts and barbs aimed at whatever part of you is most vulnerable? They can assume the other founder's artifacts may be Horcruxes, but they don't know that. They can wait for Dumbledore, but that could take years. They need Tom. Percy would like to avoid Snape forever, but he is pragmatic enough to know that he must seek the other man out and apologize. The knowledge makes it no easier to stand in front of Snape's desk, hands clasped behind his back, and muster up the bravery to say, "Professor Severus, I wanted to apologize for my behavior during our previous meeting. I spoke rudely to you and without cause." Percy catches the look of surprise on Snape's face before it flickers away into his normal, inscrutable glare. "The Horcrux is more potent than we had first believed," Snape says, which almost sounds like he is accepting Percy's apology, or at the very least excusing his behavior. "Perhaps at first, but I think—" "Well, I know that I was embarrassed at your insight," Percy says. His cheeks are burning, but he continues to speak. It is important to him, for some reason, that Snape respects him properly, and as an adult rather than a child. "Were correct about my feelings toward my father, and you were correct to verify those feelings with me. I thank you for it." Snape does not say anything in reply, but he holds Percy's gaze for a long second and then inclines his head slowly, which to Percy's surprise feels more meaningful than a reply would have been. "Perhaps we should swear a vow," Percy suggests. He quirks his lips in an attempt at humor. Nothing shall pass these walls. At least I may be less liable to snap at you out of embarrassment. Somehow they end up swearing it, that neither shall reveal personal details about the other or about their shared mission, unless the other person gives them permission, or the war could be considered over. Percy had always known that Snape would trap him into a vow. He'd been expecting it ever since he'd revealed the truth to Snape originally, and let Snape know, in return, that Percy knew some of the story of Lily Evans. The surprise here is that Snape swears the vow back. Something about that feels meaningful. Something about that is to be treasured later, in bed, the warm feeling of mutual respect so unexpected from Severus Snape, and yet so strangely important to him. "I believe it is my turn," says Snape, without a smile, but nevertheless with a glimpse of humor, after the vows have been sworn and the charged moment faded. As before, he turns to the desk and levitates the diadem without touching it. But this time, he steels himself and reaches for the diadem, setting it on top of his dark, greasy hair. The smoke condenses into Lily. Percy tenses instinctively, a dark wave of anger rolling into the room, the air changing as tangibly as if the sky outside had suddenly turned grey. A muscle jumps in Snape's cheek, but he does not otherwise react to Lily materializing in front of him. She is stunningly beautiful. People had often said that Ginny is reminiscent of Lily, but the only similarity seems to be their bright red hair. Lily is tall, with delicate features, whereas Ginny has the sturdier, muscular build of a professional athlete. Her green eyes, even in this murky form, are exactly Harry's. Even for a man with 6 siblings, the similarity between Harry and Lily in this way is striking, and Percy understands suddenly why so many people bring it up when they see Harry for the first time. 4 of the 7 Weasley children have their mother's brown eyes, Ron, Charlie, and Bill with their father's blue. But none of them are so similar that an outsider would notice at first glance. "Severus," says Lily, and her voice is a gust of sadness and longing. "Severus, I have missed you." Snape swallows roughly. It is a mark of how much this interaction is costing Snape that he is so openly distressed. Percy eyes him and fingers his wand, ready with the air-thinning spell in case of errant fiendfire. But Snape is not angry. In this moment he is sad, incredibly sad, so sad that Percy struggles to think of a more appropriate word. His sorrow, or what Percy can glimpse of it, is so clearly deep and still, like the ocean on a windless night, that to compare it to Percy's grief over losing Fred would be an insult. Maybe George would understand a sadness like this, but Percy is nearly too ashamed to admit to himself that he never wants to similarly comprehend the depths of Snape's emotions. "Lily," says Snape, and the word seems to encompass an entire world. "Help me." These 3 words seem almost too much for Snape to bear. Percy has no doubt that if he had not sworn the vow just moments prior, Snape would have not allowed him to witness this. Even so, Snape must believe the threat of the Horcrux truly dangerous to let Percy to remain. Percy remembers how vulnerable he had felt, how angry, how embarrassed, just to know that Snape knew some of his insecurities around his father, and cannot help but be ashamed that Snape must reveal himself at all. Lily looks at Snape sorrowfully. "I cannot help you, Severus," she whispers. "You know why." Though he'd insinuated otherwise to Snape, Percy does not actually know the particulars of this story. He knows Snape had loved Lily, loved her enough to guard her son in secret for years. But this sorrow extends beyond merely the grief of losing a loved one. Severus' nostrils flare just slightly, but his voice is steady when he responds. "You must. I need to know where they are, Lily. To destroy them or to use them." Lily breathes, shimmering in the air. "You murdered me, Severus Snape. You murdered my husband, and you would have murdered my son. What need do you have for the others?" As the observer, this time, Percy can observe how stilted some of the words are from the Horcrux, how it admits to knowledge of the other Horcruxes without hesitation. For all that the Horcrux is embedded into Ravenclaw's famous diadem, it seems less sophisticated than the diary, which was an unadulterated glimpse into the teenage Tom's mind. Perhaps because the diadem was made later, and thus contains less of Tom's soul, or perhaps the natural magic of Ravenclaw's diadem is fighting with the Horcrux, rendering it less powerful. "I am sorry," Snape says, so quietly that Percy almost does not hear the words. He pauses and then asks with difficulty, "You will not help me?" "I never loved you," Lily says in response. Her tone is harsher now and less like what Percy imagines Lily Evans actually sounded like. "I pitied you, poor, ugly Severus Snape and his little Death Eater friends. I was relieved when I no longer had you tagging at my heels." Percy sucks in a breath, but this does not seem to affect Snape, who smiles without humor. "It certainly made it easier for you to marry Potter." "James was everything you were not," Lily says, her red lips curving into a triumphant smile. "Handsome, wealthy, athletic, powerful. I would have chosen him even if we had remained friends, Severus. You murdered him out of your jealousy, but even if he were dead, I would not have chosen you." Snape shakes his head, a curious smile on his lips. "I am sorry, Lily," he says once more, and then without hesitation he lifts the diadem from his head and sets it on his desk. After a few more spells, he locks it away securely. Percy is very silent. Snape's sorrow has receded, almost visibly so, and instead he seems only tired. Certainly he is not as angry as Percy had been, nor as embarrassed, considering the scene that Percy just witnessed. "Why?" Percy starts, and then subsides. Snape gives him a look that is suddenly searing in its resignation. "The Horcrux cannot say anything I have not already thought," he says by way of explanation. "I do not believe our attempts to convince the Horcrux to help us will be of any use. Perhaps we can threaten it, or otherwise reveal the Dark Lord within, but our entreaties do nothing save embarrass us both." Percy nods hastily. He is thankful the Horcrux only showed his father, rather than Fred, or his mother, or even Penny. Over the next few weeks, they try wearing the diadem a few times more. For several times in a row, it takes the form of Dumbledore, wearing a face of condescending disappointment, similar for both Percy and Snape. Even James Potter appears once, looking shockingly like an older Harry. Percy only has a chance to gape at his ghostly form before Snape wrenches off the diadem, his face thunderous. Only some quick thinking by Percy saves the Horcrux from harm this time. He does employ the same spell McGonagall once used to quell his fiendfire, and it is only successful because Percy manages the spell before Snape's fiendfire even takes form. Snape turns on him, towering in his anger, and Percy takes the diadem and flees. Percy prudently avoids Snape for a few weeks after that, the diadem kept securely in his second trunk. The professor is noticeably furious in the days that follow. Gryffindor loses an unprecedented amount of points, and poor Harry finds himself in detention for 3 consecutive weeks after arriving late to one lesson. To Percy's interest, he sees Lupin watching Snape during this time, not warily like the other professors, but very intently. Perhaps he thinks Snape's anger is directed at Sirius Black. Percy longs to spy, but does not want to risk being caught. He finally makes up his mind about his plans for next year, submitting the application to serve as Crouch's personal assistant. He tells McGonagall one day toward the end of May. With Snape and Myrtle in the castle, he feels as if he need not remain too, even though he longs to do so. They will need a spy in the ministry, and Percy cannot risk telling his secret to anyone else. "I am not abandoning this," he says, laying his hand on his leather-bound notebook, tracing the gold vines embossing the spine. She nods slowly. "See that you don't, Mr. Weasley. Harry is 12. In 5 short years, if Percy interferes no further, he should be defeating the Dark Lord right about now. I'll be back within half a decade," he promises, thinking of that unseasonably warm day when Fred falls to his death. Professor McGonagall smiles at this. "Strong words for one without 2 decades to his name," she says teasingly. "Over 3, but she does not need to know that." He shrugs uncomfortably. "My family," he begins and then falters. "My parents. Did you know I am a half-blood, Mr. Weasley?" He blinks at her. "No, Professor. To make matters worse, my father was a muggle," she says dryly. "In those days, if the mother was a muggle, it was less egregious. Plenty a wizard fell for a pretty village girl. But a muggle father, well, that sullied the witch forever." Percy doesn't say anything, sensing she is not finished with her story. "My mother had given up her magic until I came along. No need for it. She was never a particularly good witch, and she was relatively minor and unimportant in society, and she loved my father dearly. My birth must have shocked them both. I've always a talent for wandless magic, even from the crib." McGonagall smiles conspiratorially, and Percy can suddenly see her, 11 years old, bold and mischievous. When I came to Hogwarts, I was the best, Mr. Weasley, or something close to it. Nobody sneered at me, let me tell you. Percy looks at McGonagall, thinking of arenas, thinking of bravery. I almost married a muggle, she continues, fluttering her hand as if to encompass the entire mess that must have been. Needless to say, I chose my magic over him, and it is a decision I have defended to myself to this day. Professor, Percy starts without any of the slightest idea what he's asking. I spent 2 years in the ministry trying to prove myself, she continues, as if she didn't hear. Prove I was right to be a witch, prove I could be better than all of those smart young wealthy boys who were too afraid to marry me. And then do you know what I realized, Mr. Weasley? You preferred Hogwarts. Professor McGonagall leans forward, her eyes glinting. The only way to win the war I wanted to win was to be here, she breathes, sending chills down his spine. I am not a perfect professor, Mr. Weasley, nor a perfect head of house, but I hope my house supports its students. I hope I help my students discover who they want to become. Nearly every single witch or wizard, pureblood or muggle-born or something in between, has passed through my classroom for the last 50 years. An opportunity, Percy completes, seeing his professor as if for the first time. True, he was not always happy in Gryffindor, but had she not appointed him prefect and head boy in the timeline where he clung desperately to those accolades? Had she not recognized this time how much he would thrive with her tutelage? Did she not support Oliver's unorthodox captaincy of the Quidditch team? Did she not defend Mariana when her mother wrote to question her child's poor grades? Did she not give every student a fair chance to prove themselves in her classroom? No, Professor McGonagall is not perfect, but Percy can appreciate her all the same. Are you suggesting I do the same? Professor McGonagall shakes her head, and something inside him is simultaneously relieved and disappointed. Perhaps, perhaps not, she says. I have a few years of teaching still in me, but my point is that you must know what battle you are trying to win, then you may choose how to win it. The obvious choice, the choice you make merely to prove something to someone, the choice that seems inevitable. These may be merely secondary to the choice you have yet to consider. I admit I hope you return here, to scholarship and perhaps to teaching, but all I ask is that you ask yourself during these next few years what it is that makes you feel powerful, what it is that makes you want to fight for your right to belong somewhere. Percy has yet another urge to blurt everything out, but he restrains himself with difficulty. There may be a day, Professor, where I come to you with a rather unbelievable story, he says instead, meeting her eyes solidly. Will you promise me that no matter when that is, no matter what you may think of me, that you will allow me the opportunity to share it with you? Her eyes narrow fractionally. If it were Snape, Percy would already be feeling the pressure of his mind penetrating Percy's. Since it's McGonagall, however, she only employs the considerable weapon of her undivided attention before nodding briskly. I hope you do, Mr. Weasley. I promise you that if you come to me, I shall listen. June 1993, Snape and Percy had planned their abduction of Pettigrew for the second weekend in June, right after exams. Instead, events come to a head 7 days prior. It begins with Ron and Hermione having a screaming match in the common room. Your utter disregard for the rules, your lack of feelings and emotion. Harry, poor Harry, steps bravely between them and suggests they all go down for a visit to Hagrid. Ron turns on him, face ugly, and Harry takes a step back as if physically struck. Percy, fool as he is, intervenes, not least because the other seventh years are stirring, angry at the disruption this close to their final Newt examinations. Ron apologized to Harry at once. You're not Mum, Percy. Why don't you ever just stay out of it? Harry is your best friend and you'll regret this, Ronald. Apologize now. Ron storms from the common room. Harry hurries after him, and Hermione, slamming her books down in a huff of annoyance, looks irritatedly around her before reluctantly following suit. He's really not always like this, Hermione. He's always like this to me. Percy, critically, does not follow. In fact, Percy stays put in the common room for a few more hours, enjoying the sounds of quills scratching across paper as even the chaotic wild energy of Gryffindor Tower is channeled into frantic exam review. Percy spends the majority of his time alone, and often he prefers it like that. But sometimes he has to admit there is something pleasant about being around the ambient sounds of other humans, as long as they do not disturb him. So he startles quite significantly when nearly headless Nick appears in the middle of the table, his head spearing the sheaf of notes Percy had been accumulating on self-transfiguration. "Sir Nicholas," Percy gasps, rocking backward in his chair, a great garb of ink smearing over his carefully transcribed notes of McGonagall's last lecture. Some of the other Gryffindors look up, but seeing that it is only their house ghost choosing an unfortunate place to materialize, return to their notes all the more frantically. "My apologies, dear boy," chuckles the ghost, adjusting his head to more securely attach to his pearly neck. "Myrtle has a message for you. She says that the wormhood potion you were tending for Professor Snape in his absence has boiled over, and you ought to hurry if you want to revive it before the professor returns." For a second, Percy just stares, perplexed, at the ghost. A wormhood potion. Wormhood is an ingredient in many other potions, but Percy cannot think of what Myrtle may be referring to, least of all because Percy is not tending to any potion, and why would Snape be absent? Then realization dawns, and Percy swears to himself as he takes a second to bundle all of his notes together and banish them back to the dormitory. Not wormhood, but wormtail. The trio has been gone for quite some time. More Gryffindors look up this time as Percy makes his frantic way across the common room, navigating around piles of parchment and squishy red chairs with barely any margin for error. Alexander, in the chair closest to the door, even wishes him luck and informs him that they will have a solemn funeral for him after the newts, if Snape offs him in his ire. "Thanks," grunts Percy and dives through the portrait hole, transforming into the Lynx on the other end and taking off in a sprint to Snape's office. The confrontation must have happened. Somehow, the trio's arguments must have set it off. Maybe Hermione finally thought to try a Point Me or an Accio to fetch Scabbers, and Sirius Black came out of hiding. Maybe Black got tired of waiting and pounced on Ron. But why would Snape have been involved? And why would he not have alerted Percy himself? When he arrives at Snape's office, panting even in Lynx form, Myrtle and the map are waiting for him. Asterisk, finally, Myrtle says as Percy pads inside and then transforms back into his wizard self. "What?" he gasps at her, a bit disgusted by how sweaty he is even after the transformation. By Merlin, he's really got to exercise regularly, one of these days. Myrtle gestures toward the map. They had agreed that among the three of them, one of them would be monitoring the map at all times, at least so they could be somewhat forewarned if either Pettigrew or Black acted unexpectedly. "I came to see what Professor Snape was doing, and to take over watching the map," she explains, "since you had to study for the newts, even though we both know you're going to pass, and I found the map open on his desk, but the office empty." Percy performs a quick scourgify on his body, wincing at the feeling of the spell wiping a rough cloth against his skin and robes, and then takes a look at the map. It does not take him very long to see a rather upsetting confluence of dots, out at the very edge of the map near the Whomping Willow. Snape, Lupin, Black, Pettigrew, and the three infernal teenagers who are the bane of Percy's existence. Why had Snape not alerted him? Percy is surprised by how hurt he feels by the thought. "Must have felt he had to run," Myrtle says, divining the direction of his thoughts with surprising accuracy. "He left the map out for you, Percy." Percy grimaces, but has to admit that Myrtle is probably right. Snape is not the type to leave something like the map out without a reason. Then Myrtle gasps, and Percy feels her shock like a mist of very fine droplets of water. "Wait, Percy, it's you," she says, and Percy follows her translucent finger to see his own name moving across the grounds. "What?" Percy says out loud, watching as the darts perform an intricate dance that he cannot understand. The trio begins to run back to the castle, panicked, if the speed of their darts moving is any indication. Black, for some reason, heads off into the forest, and Lupin follows him, and Snape begins to follow the trio closely on their heels, even as Pettigrew's dart makes a break for it and begins sprinting toward Hagrid's hut, Percy close behind. "I don't understand," says Myrtle quietly. Watch as Percy follows Pettigrew off the boundaries of the map, as Percy has certainly never gone to that section of the Forbidden Forest before, and certainly has no intention of it. And then Percy sees something which clarifies and obscurates the matter even further. Harry, Ron, and Hermione are also on the boundaries of the map, heading toward the Great Lake, their darts on the map twice each, and Percy suddenly realizes what part of the puzzle he is missing. "It's the time turner," he breathes, surprised. "What? Hermione has a time turner." Myrtle flies through him, and he shivers at the intrusion. "Hermione has a time turner, and you didn't tell me." "I forgot to mention it," Percy says honestly. He'd watched her for a few weeks, of course, but it seemed fairly obvious that Hermione was only using the thing to go to her classes. His classmates might tease him about being a swot, but he only maintains that fiction to deflect interest into his extracurricular activities. Hermione takes it to another level. "I meant to bring it up, but something else kept getting in the way." "So you must have gone through time too," Myrtle says, her mind leaping ahead. "But Percy, isn't that incredibly dangerous? You know, since you've already—" Percy nods to himself as she trails off. "It could be incredibly dangerous, but clearly he seems to be doing just fine, given that he saw his dart moving around on the map." "Pettigrew must have escaped, maybe in rat form," he says, thinking out loud. "Maybe that's why Lupin and Black ran into the forest to find him. They all split up. But none of them thought to use a point-me charm. I must somehow get the time turner from Hermione, since I can see that they aren't going to catch Pettigrew," Percy continues, mostly to himself. "We know that the time turner can go back 7 hours, so I have 6, maybe 5 hours to get the time turner from Hermione and use it. But they are also using it, so I need to use it after they have already returned." "I don't know," Myrtle says doubtfully. "That seems awfully risky, Percy." "I think it's what we have to do," Percy insists, looking up from the map to meet Myrtle in the eyes. "Look, Pettigrew has to go to the Dark Lord, and he has to bring him back, otherwise nothing we've done has been for anything." "I can't keep waiting for the timeline to develop, Myrtle. Clearly we've changed it already. We have to make sure this, at least, goes as scheduled." "What if Pettigrew sees you and wonders why a Weasley is chasing him?" Myrtle counters. "And wasn't the plan for Snape to Imperius him? Are you going to do it if he doesn't come?" "He'll come," says Percy with conviction. "Look, we have to wait for the trio to come back from their little adventure. We know the time turner can't be used more than once by the same person in the same timeline. That's basic time magic theory. If we watch the map, we'll know what's going to happen, and then it'll be easy to do it again." Myrtle shakes her head, her long hair gleaming in the dark of Snape's office. "Just because you know something is going to happen doesn't mean it'll be easy." "That much I already know, Myrtle," he snaps back, and they subside into a tense silence as they watch the map carefully for clues. It is nearly an hour later that the next stage of the drama seems to unfold. Percy sits up straight, alerting Myrtle, who had lost interest in watching Black and Lupin chase each other around the forest. Lupin begins careening intentionally toward the castle, where Snape and the trio had been standing for several minutes. Percy imagines Snape's castigation of the 3 teenagers and feels a little sorry for them, with Black hot on his heels. Percy watches, fascinated, as Lupin, Black, and Snape circle each other, dueling perhaps. Then Lupin breaks away, running back toward the forest. Black and Snape's darts are very close together, almost overlapping, and then to Percy's bewilderment, he sees Cornelius Fudge begin to walk down with Albus Dumbledore. Black, understandably, seems to flee, but the trio follows him. Percy shakes his head. "What is happening?" "I think Fudge must have been alerted that Black is here," Myrtle says slowly. "The trio must be trying to help him escape, and Snape is covering their tracks. It doesn't make sense. The rest of it seems to unfold very quickly. Harry, Ron, and Hermione's darts, both of them, almost seem to converge at the Great Lake, one set of the teenagers with Black, another set seemingly hiding in the copse of trees a few meters away. Snape, Fudge, and Dumbledore seem to be conversing, and then Fudge and Dumbledore break off toward the Shrieking Shack, and Snape seems to be making his way toward the Great Lake, before he abruptly changes direction and begins heading toward where Percy and Pettigrew had last been. Percy keeps watching. Both sets of the trio seems to linger together, with Black near the lake. Are they communicating? Surely Hermione would know that was strictly forbidden. They linger there until Percy and Snape appear as well, and then for some reason one set of the trio disappears one by one. Then Percy and Snape begin to head back to the castle together. Then, after a few minutes, the other trio leaves Black, who begins to make his way toward the Quidditch pitch of all places. "That made absolutely no sense," Myrtle says into the quiet. Percy nods in agreement, but then adds, "It doesn't really matter for me, though, does it?" "What do you mean?" Percy checks his watch and says, "Well, we know at 10:43 in the evening Snape is trying to find me, and presumably Pettigrew. We know that I appear on the map at 7:45. I don't think I care very much about what is happening with Black and the trio. We just need to get to Pettigrew, which means that by 7:45 I need to be out on the grounds, catching him." "That was very odd, Percy," Myrtle says unnecessarily, gesturing at the map. "I don't like this at all." "I don't think you should go." "I already have, Myrtle," Percy points out, feeling a flash of impatience. "I already have, so now we just have to figure out how I've done it. We need to get to the time turner." In a way, the surety that underlies Percy's next few actions is familiar. He misses it in a nostalgic sort of way, remembering the conviction he'd had in his actions those first few years in his new life. The sense that everything was proceeding on plan, of course, because it had already, and all he had to do to ensure the timeline was stable was to stay out of the way. Now, it does not take a seer or a time traveler to know that Percy has irrevocably changed the timeline. Percy no longer feels the satisfaction of pieces falling into place, but rather the constant pressure of uncertainty pricking the skin around his shoulders and upsetting his stomach. Percy has not been able to eat anything more than half a plate of food for many weeks. The only recourse he has is to hope, over and over again, that he is not causing waves large enough to drown him and the rest of the world besides. So it is a relief to feel once again like his actions are preordained. It is a relief to wait by the girls' dormitory, ostensibly waiting for his sister, until Hermione brushes by him and heads directly to the bathrooms. It is a relief to loiter there unobtrusively until he feels Myrtle's cold form brush by him. Confirmation that Hermione is showering off the remnants of the stressful day, as he had thought she might, thereby leaving the time turner open to theft. This time, he does not bother with an imperious. His summoning charm is so precise that the time turner whistles through the air and smacks into his palm. It is a relief to feel the gleaming metal, to marvel at the intricate gears. It is a bit less of a relief to sneak off with it and put its gold chain over his head and take a second to hope that he is not being impulsive. He really ought to not go back in time. He knows the theory. He knows that to go back in time twice concurrently is incredibly dangerous, and at times irreversible. But he tells himself that the ritual he chose did not exactly throw him back in time, not in the same way, but rather created an alternate universe where he now lives. It should be fine. "Percy, close your eyes," Myrtle says just as he is about to spin the delicate little dial. "Now." The command in her voice shocks him, and his eyes flutter shut of his own accord. A second later, he feels a solid body brush past him, and to his utter surprise, his heart jumps a little in his chest. He recognizes the scent of pine soap that he has favored the last few years in Hogwarts. It is him. Percy longs to open his eyes, but Myrtle hovers directly in front of him, casting a cool breeze on his face, and he knows not to risk it. To see your future self is expressly forbidden, though he desperately wishes he could ask the Percy of 7 hours hence whether everything goes as planned. That Percy does not say anything either. Percy takes that to be a good sign. He'd warn himself, damn the consequences, if there was death or destruction ahead, wouldn't he? He hears a faint buzzing fill his ears, and the indignity that his own self cast a privacy ward to keep him out of the conversation nearly makes him open his eyes. Then the sensation falls away, and Myrtle says, her voice subdued, "He's gone." They are alone in the corridor. "What did he say?" Percy says urgently, turning on the ghost. She squints at him, her glasses gleaming, and then says deliberately, "I think you ought to go in your form." "I can't do magic in my form," he points out slowly, his mind whirring over the implication that he had told Myrtle to tell him that he ought to be a lynx. Why? To avoid detection. Perhaps just to catch Pettigrew, who is likely in rat form. "Just do it, Percy, will you?" Myrtle snaps, her voice rising into the type of hysterical cry he hasn't heard from her in years. He exhales through his nose and then nods once before turning the small dial on the time turner. The corridor blurs around him. It's a bit like a portkey, if a portkey was horrid and filled his stomach with gurgling fire. It's a bit like apparition, too, if apparition squeezed every fiber of his being until he wanted to scream and explode from the pressure. It's a bit like the flu as well, the sense that the entire world is swirling around him. Then it stops, and Percy falls to the ground, gasping, wanting to scream. His head feels incredibly tight, as if he has plummeted many meters underground and the air pressure has irrevocably changed. His stomach is churning, and his vision is blurry despite his glasses. As he coughs, unable to get off his hands and knees, he feels his heartbeat thudding loudly through his body, pounding in his ears, and he wants to scream. His body feels alien, his fingers distant, his skin burning, as if he is occupying a space he has no right to be in. Gradually, slowly, he comes back to himself. His magic surges and dances around him, outlining his body in gold sparks, and then forcibly pulling all of the millions of pieces that comprise his body together with a snap. He calls to it, first instinctively and then with purpose, using all of what he'd learned from Tom to force his magic come to his aid, until he feels the warmth of his magic settle around him like a cloak, and the roaring in his ears begins to abate. His head still throbs, and his stomach still gurgles uncomfortably, but he is able to look around him and slowly, slowly pull himself to his feet. If that is what it feels like to use a time turner, no wonder they are not more commonly stolen from the Department of Mysteries. Percy wonders how Hermione stands it. His clock charm is a bit flaky, the numbers blurring into each other, but he looks at it and sees he has only 17 minutes to get outside. After a frantic run through the castle, Percy skids through the open doors and makes a beeline to the Whomping Willow. It is growing dark, despite the summer day, and his body instinctively presses to the ground as his lynx eyes register that it is the full moon. Something about that is significant, but Percy cannot bring his mind to focus on it. As a lynx, he already struggles to focus on his human concerns. His lynx senses persistently and continuously trying to direct his attention to the realities of their existence. The smell of old blood, the whistle of the Whomping Willow's thin branches as they crack and bend through the air, the mournful caw of a bird circling overhead. With the added confusion from the time turner, his mind feels like jelly, sliding over one concern and then another as if they are immaterial. He waits panting at the edge of the willow, and then whines and darts behind a small bush as a passageway implausibly opens in the tree itself. The shock is enough to clear some of the lynx thoughts from his befuddled mind, and a strange procession appears out of it. Ron, Hermione, Harry, Sirius Black, talking in low tones to Harry. Lupin, looking elated, levitating a bound Peter Pettigrew. Snape, bringing up the rear with a perfectly blank face. Perhaps wondering how to get Pettigrew out of this situation without alerting everyone else to Snape's plan. Percy narrows his eyes and hisses softly, pawing at the dirt. It looks as if everything is under control. Perhaps he misunderstood the map. Then everything changes. Lupin stiffens, Pettigrew falling to the ground with an unpleasant thud. He throws his head up to the sky, every tendon in his neck sinewy and visible, his eyes tracking something invisible in the sky. Percy's lynx mind registers the danger before his human brain does, and he is 10 paces away by the time Lupin transforms into a werewolf and howls at the sky. It's a blur of noise and motion, too confusing and overwhelming for him to fully process. Black, transforming into the dog, the trio taking off at a sprint to the castle, Snape close behind, and the ropes around Pettigrew collapsing as he transforms into a rat. Percy's heart stops, and then starts again with uneven, terrified stutters. The werewolf is massive and terrifying, an ugly, scarred snout over intelligent eyes, its entire body a dangerous spring of muscles and claws. It is the most terrifying thing Percy has ever seen, and to his horror, he sees the beast turn to the trio and howl. Percy howls back, surprising himself, and the werewolf cuts itself off, turning its attention to Percy. Percy shivers and whines, his body recoiling into himself, and both his animal and his human mind go absolutely blank with terror as the werewolf begins to make its inquisitive way over to Percy and Pettigrew. Except, even in Percy's fear, he registers that Pettigrew is bounding away in the opposite direction, tearing across the ground as fast as his rat feet can take him. Another animal yelps, and the werewolf stops again, his head turning to this new, interesting sound. Percy feels his heart stutter and begin to start, and then he tenses his muscles in an attempt to release his fear. Pettigrew. They need Pettigrew. Go, Percy tells himself, and he lets his lynx senses take over as he leaps after the rat. The rat is fast and agile, darting with unerring accuracy toward the forbidden forest. It takes all of Percy's instincts, feline and human, to track him and hunt him down. They dodge trees and vines, leap over small puddles in the ground, and twist around animals as if they aren't even there. Pettigrew doesn't dive for a hole or the base of a tree like Percy had expected. He runs in a flat-out tilt toward some invisible destination. The edge of the wards, Percy realizes, lunging faster. He gives himself entirely over to the lynx, feeling his rage and fear subside into bloodlust and anticipation. The rat is his prey, and he's hungry. He sees the muscles in the rat's hind quarters bunch. He's fainting. And there, Percy's jaws come down on Scabbers, and only at the last second does he remember not to bite down. Scabbers freezes, his body quivering in fear. He doesn't know that Percy is the lynx, or maybe he does. He's clearly deciding whether to transform back, as is Percy, but they both hear the low growl of a much more dangerous animal and stay precisely as they are. Percy would have said that staring into the eyes of the basilisk, even in memory, was the most frightening experience of his life to date. Looking up into the golden eyes of Lupin the werewolf, a Death Eater clutched between his jaws, surpassed that by several orders of magnitude. For a long, silent second, the animals stare at each other. With some instinct Percy didn't know he had, he bows, exposing his neck in an act of submission. Pettigrew is perfectly still inside his mouth, and suddenly Sirius is there, or at least a large black dog, nipping at the werewolf's heels. Lupin turns and snarls, and Sirius flees, enticing the wolf to chase after him. Percy exhales in relief. Pettigrew takes the opportunity to try and wiggle free. Percy bites down again, feeling the rat's heartbeat stutter in his mouth. If Pettigrew were to transform back right now, Percy realizes, some of his human logic returning after the lust of the hunt, it would kill Percy, so Percy has to transform first and catch Pettigrew. He almost doesn't make it. The moment Percy drops Scabbers, the rat lunges again, but Percy has gone through 3 years of animagus practice with McGonagall and is able to transform back, orient on the rat, and hit him with a stunning spell before the rat makes it more than a few meters away. Then he transforms back to a lynx, creeping over to place his paws over the rat. He does not want to be human, not tonight, not here. Percy sits there, motionless, for the next 2 hours, too afraid to move, too afraid to think. He relaxes into the lynx, not wanting to consider what his next move would have to be, not wanting to contemplate his brother on the run from a werewolf. He had to go after Pettigrew. He saw Ron himself, returning with Hermione and Harry to the common room. The time travel paradox states that what will happen has already happened. If Ron was going to be attacked by the werewolf, it would have already happened. But he still left his 13-year-old brother in danger again. How many times is he going to do this? How many more times will he stay in the shadows, as lynx or human or something else, while his brother and Harry and Hermione put themselves in danger? Finally, Snape arrives. Percy backs away from Pettigrew, hiding in the shadows at least one more time, and as he'd thought, Snape forces Pettigrew to wake and revert back to his human form with a few savage jabs of his wand. Crucio, Snape breathes, almost lovingly, and Pettigrew howls with misery, an unearthly, inhuman sound that causes Percy to whine softly in sympathy before he realizes he's making a sound. Snape trains the spell on Pettigrew for just a minute before stopping, letting the man pant in agony on the forest floor. "We have just a second, Pettigrew, or should I say Wormtail," Snape says mockingly. "Answer carefully, for your life depends on it. Are you loyal to the Dark Lord?" "Are you?" Pettigrew huffs out boldly. Crucio. This time Pettigrew only shrieks for 30 seconds before Snape ends the spell. "I'm loyal, damn you," sobs Pettigrew, shaking and making no effort to untwist his body from its contortions in the mud. "Even if it has cost me everything I have. You have spent 12 years of your own volition with the Weasleys. One wonders whether the cost was enacted by your loyalty or your incompetence. Now, the Dark Lord is still alive," Snape says, enunciating carefully. "He is but a shade. I'm sure you recall Quirrell, or were you too busy dodging cats to notice your lord possessing a professor in the castle you inhabit? Find him, Pettigrew, and let him know that he has followers waiting to take up the call. Inform me as soon as you find him." "But you're Dumbledore's," Pettigrew gasps. Snape rolls his eyes. "By Merlin's beard, one would think you've never heard of an alibi. Let's make this easy for your rat brain then, shall we? Imperio." Snape locks eyes intently with Pettigrew, whose face goes slack instantly. Percy does not know what instructions exactly he is passing to Pettigrew, and for a second he doubts himself. Maybe Snape has been fooling him this whole time. But no, if there was one thing Harry was abundantly clear about, it was that Severus Snape, hated professor, was loyal to the bitter end to Albus Dumbledore. On that last, well, Percy doubts very much it was solely Dumbledore who commanded Snape's loyalty through 2 wars, but at the very least he commanded Snape. "Go," Snape says, releasing Pettigrew. "Now." Pettigrew nods his head shakily and disappears. Percy tracks his progression until he's out of even a lynx's line of sight, and then looks up to Snape, who nods slightly. Percy transforms into himself, brushing dirt off his robes. He aims for nonchalant, as if the sight of his professor casually wielding 2 unforgivables is perfectly normal. Improvising. Snape gives him a sour look, seemingly unsurprised at Percy's presence. "How did this debacle start tonight, I wonder?" he comments flatly as they begin to walk back to the castle. "5 Galleons says it's due to your idiocy or Potter's." Percy ignores this somewhat accurate summation of the situation and focuses on the important consideration left unanswered. The trio. Snape's look of disdain is potent enough to momentarily stop Percy in his tracks. Well, they're a bit young yet for the nickname, but it's convenient, and Percy really has more important things to worry about. "Professor is my brother unharmed." "He should be," Snape begins, but trails off. Ahead, too far to make out clearly, a dark cloud amassess over the edge of the lake. Percy frowns at it. Crows, shadows. "Dementors," breathes Snape, and starts to run. Percy is close at his heels, a feeling of panic welling up inside his chest. Happy memory, he counsels himself, even as Snape sends his doe bounding ahead, even as he grapples uselessly with the spell. Percy has avoided the Dementors all year, but he dreads passing by them on the way to Hogsmeade. When Harry had fallen from the sky, the Dementors swarming overhead as the sky thundered, Percy's heart had stopped, and his skin had turned cold. He'd practiced his Patronus for hours, but he can only manage his raven intermittently, and never with any confidence. "Weasley, whatever ineptitude is preventing your Patronus from materializing, I want it dispatched with now," Snape bites over his shoulder. "We're still too far, but it may help stave away others." Percy speeds up. "I'm trying. Oh Merlin, oh Merlin." A stag, brilliant and silver, materializes out of nowhere. The stag is the most beautiful thing that Percy has ever seen, save perhaps the Philosopher's Stone, or maybe even the basilisk. It glows with intensity and focus, and the Dementors turn to it as one, sensing perhaps their own downfall. When it charges, mist seems to swirl from its side, settling over the prone figures, and now that they're closer, Percy can see 3 prone figures, and reviving them slightly. Snape curses and casts his doe again, sending it into the fray. Seeing the doe and the stag dance around each other, trailing silver streaks of mist and magic behind them, is oddly beautiful and oddly balanced. But Percy does not get distracted by the question of precisely whose stag that was. He knows the trio is nearly somewhere hiding, but certainly a Patronus would be out of the reach of 3 13-year-olds. He casts a cursory glance around him, but most of his attention is focused on the bodies by the lake. As he and Snape arrive, they drop to their knees beside the trio. "Black isn't here," Snape murmurs to himself as he casts diagnostic spells at Harry, Percy dividing his attention between Ron and Hermione. "Why did they attack if Black wasn't here?" "We've got to take them to the hospital wing, Professor," Percy says urgently. Ron's eyes are fluttering, but his skin is pale, his freckles like dark stains against a white sheet. Snape turns and casts an assessing glance around them, but the lake is empty, the large tree at its bank silent. He narrows his eyes, clearly puzzling over the situation they stumbled into. "Tick-tock," whispers an echo of Tom in Percy's ear, and Percy shakes his head. He needs to get back soon before he runs out of time. "Professor, can you get Harry?" This snaps Snape out of whatever contemplation had settled over his face. Snape nods once, briskly, and levitates Harry. "We're still so far," Percy says worriedly as they begin to walk away from the lake. He stops in his tracks. Mimsy, dutiful, loyal, still answering to his commands. Mimsy. She appears in a second, bowing low. Master Percy, she says with a gasp. What is you've done? Can you take us all to the hospital wing right now? Percy asks urgently. Mimsy eyes Snape. Whatever feat of logic she's used to excuse her taking commands from Percy clearly may not stand up in the face of an actual Hogwarts professor witnessing her disobedience. Snape exhales in irritation. Elf, do as he says. When she still hesitates, he speaks sharply. I am commanding you. This decides it for Mimsy, and with a pop she disappears first with Hermione, then with Ron, then with Harry. Leave the lying to me. Percy nods. I need to go back. I used Hermione's time turner. A time turner. Snape has just enough time to ask incredulously before Mimsy returns for him. Left alone, Percy takes a moment to look around him, to the dark Hogwarts grounds lit only by the pale full moon, and then he transforms back into the lynx for the last time, feeling his muscles complain from the strain of the unfamiliar movements. He pads slowly back toward the castle, beginning to process the panic that his adrenaline and intellectual curiosity has held at bay for the past few hours. They've been lucky, incredibly lucky. Percy isn't sure where Black is, hopefully alive, but Pettigrew has been tasked with finding the Dark Lord, and all three members of the trio are alive. One hurdle down, several to go, but at least one plot set into motion. You look awful, says Myrtle, the second that Percy enacts his privacy wards. Percy eyes his past self, obediently and grumpily closing his eyes, and feels privately that he looks awful too. What happened? Snape sent Pettigrew away with the Imperius, Percy confirms, and Myrtle sags with relief. Everyone lived, I think, though the trio seemed to nearly succumb to the Dementors. And the time magic. Percy thinks of that terrible, awful second where his body had not yet formed, where his magic swirled around him like waves in a whirlpool, where had he not known to call his magic to him, he would have dissipated into the wind, a blur of insubstantial magic released into the world, and shivers. Never again, he says with emphasis. Should you still go? Myrtle asks hesitantly. Percy looks again at his past self, at the dark circles under his eyes and the mulish set of his jaw. It is strange to see him, his nearly adult body, more familiar than any of the selves he's seen in the mirror for the last 7 years. I have to, he says heavily. Tell him to go in his form. I don't think I can tell him that, can I? Percy looks up and meets her gaze. Lupin is a werewolf, and tonight is the full moon, he says meaningfully, and Myrtle pales to a ghostly white. The next day, Percy is, predictably, summoned to see the headmaster. Trapped in the uncomfortably small chair in front of the ornate wooden desk, watching all manner of silver instruments whirl and shake dubiously, Percy tries to press his heels into the plush carpet to ground himself. Facing Dumbledore never seems to be easier. Dumbledore's voice is less warm than it had been when Percy was 11, but it is not particularly aggressive. You say you followed them. I saw them all rushing out of the common room, and it was very close to curfew, Percy says, avoiding Dumbledore's gaze by staring at his knees. I should have alerted a professor. I'm sorry, Professor. Percy looks up, his eyes wide, his mind filled with his fear, hoping to deflect the questioning he'd known he would be subjected to by Dumbledore. Did you know Professor Lupin was a werewolf, headmaster? Prejudice is beneath you, Mr. Weasley, Dumbledore chides gently. It's not prejudice when he forgets to take a potion and nearly kills my brother, Percy snaps back. Time for another attack. Professor, why aren't the grounds warded against unregistered animagi? I looked up the registry when I registered. Neither Black nor Pettigrew are on the list. If animagi can get through the wards, that's a huge security risk, headmaster. Quite, Dumbledore says dryly. Rest assured, Mr. Weasley, that vulnerability will not remain for long. Please continue. Well, when my brother hadn't come back to the common room, I thought I ought to go look for him. I saw all of the Dementors outside, and I heard Ron yelling. I saw Professor Snape outside as well. He flushes, genuinely embarrassed, and admits, I couldn't get my Patronus to work. Professor Snape, I think, cast his. There was a large stag, but I still don't know whose Patronus that was. Dumbledore smiles enigmatically. One of Hogwarts' many mysteries, he excuses himself. Percy eyes him but doesn't comment. Then Professor Snape summoned a house elf. That's the end of it, sir. Thank you for your actions. Dumbledore says warmly. Once again, your quick thinking may have saved your brother's life. Mr. Weasley, I had asked you to keep me apprised of any oddities occurring, yet I did not hear from you all year. Percy's ears burned slightly. Nothing happened all year, sir. They spent most of the year fighting over their pets. Dumbledore chuckles and then stands, walking to where Fawkes is eyeing Percy rather pugnaciously for a peace-bearing bird. Oh, 13. What a difficult age. Well, Mr. Weasley, I understand you are taking on a post with the Ministry after you graduate our hallowed halls. Minerva was most upset that you declined her offer. Percy nods, but doesn't say anything. Dumbledore turns and looks at Percy. I would ask you to continue to keep me informed in your new role, he says steadily. I believe you have read the signs as I have. We may be in turmoil, Mr. Weasley. Percy's mouth is suddenly dry. He nods again. Please do not leave anything out, no matter how trivial. We can agree that even arguments about pets have longer-reaching implications. Both Severus and Minerva can filter the information and update me as needed. How truly condescending, particularly when Dumbledore has the audacity to ask Percy to spy on his new manager for his old school headmaster. Down, Percy, the memory of Tom's voice whispers in Percy's head. Percy nods and tries to look honored. Yes, headmaster. Dumbledore smiles and returns to his desk. Anything else you'd like to tell me, Mr. Weasley? A movement from behind Dumbledore catches Percy's attention. Phineas Nigellus has made his way to a frame right behind Dumbledore's head. The figure leans forward as if he could escape the painted canvas, looking intently at Percy, whose reply dies in his throat as he meets the cold gaze of his ancestor. Clearly unimpressed, Phineas narrows his eyes at Percy, letting his gaze drag over Percy's body. The portraits, Percy says, the words falling out of his mouth before he can realize he's opened his mouth. They are different, these portraits, than the ones outside. Dumbledore does not look thrown by the question, though Percy doubts that Dumbledore had expected him to mention the portraits. They are indeed, dear boy, says the headmaster serenely, though the glint behind his half-moon glasses reminds Percy uncomfortably of the diadem. Not many have realized that. They have their own magic, says Percy, still looking at Phineas, who looks steadily back at Percy, one eyebrow cocked as if to challenge whatever Percy is going to say next. Each of these portraits. They are their own anchor. Something in Dumbledore's eyes seems to sharpen. Minerva did not exaggerate your intelligence, he says, but to Percy it sounds more like an accusation than a compliment. If that is all, my boy, I will ask you to leave. I have a prior appointment to keep with Professor Lupin, and he is rather punctual. Percy nods distractedly, taking one last glance at Phineas before wrenching his gaze away. It is odd to see one of his direct ancestors like that, as if they were alive, evaluating him as he speaks. He wonders whether Phineas ever watches him in the hallways, whether he asks Dumbledore about Draco or Tonks or any of his other descendants. The portrait of Phineas is different from the portraits outside the headmaster's office. Percy muses, as he follows Dumbledore silently down the rotating staircase and politely bids him a good afternoon at the base of the stairs. Percy had felt it, as Phineas had looked at him so quietly and so intently. The portrait of Phineas is crisper, cleaner, more alive than the portraits dotting the halls. Percy would not have been surprised to see the man step out of the frame and come to life, his cool, imperious gaze all the more chilling on a real wizard's face. The newts go precisely as Percy had planned. The exams feel comfortable, like an old friend, and he takes a vicious pleasure in the way that his quill scratches authoritatively across the parchment. He will not have many tests in his future that he already knows how to pass, and so he methodically and carefully excels on each exam, so that at least he has the memory of this triumph if later trials are too hard to bear. Landon does not succeed in a permanent charm, but he proves something interesting, or at least he boasts to Sonali and Percy and Henry, and the rest after the charm's practical has finished. Definitely an outstanding, he assures Percy, who remains quiet, allowing Landon to gloat without dampening his spirits. Percy most definitely got the first after all. Percy's light ritual to protect a treasured item from breakage, while interesting, is not as impressive as he'd hoped, though Professor Vector seemed quite taken with Percy's 10 neatly tabulated scrolls, each containing formulae and rune diagrams labeled, cross-referenced, and clearly delineated. The project had quite fallen by the wayside, despite his aspirations for it. The last weekend of term, however, Percy spends by himself in the library. He has one last assignment to study for before he leaves the castle and erases Ignatius P. from the book of records that has faithfully hidden his reading activities for the last 7 years. Asterisk, you wanted Lupin to be revealed as a werewolf. Snape looks darkly pleased with himself, a smile curling the corner of his lips. I am affronted, nay, appalled at the insinuation. You knew it was a full moon, insists Percy. You knew Lupin would forget the potion. I did not know, corrects Snape. His smile widens. I merely suspected. My brother could have become a werewolf. Snape's smile slides off his lips so quickly that Percy blinks, taken aback. Your brother was in no real danger, not while Sirius Black was there. You didn't know Black would be able to forestall Lupin. I knew, Snape says, voice filled with malice. You couldn't have known, objects Percy, clenching his jaw. They could have all died, and for what? Because you don't like Lupin. Snape leans forward, his dark eyes glittering, and hisses, I knew Weasley. The beast tried to kill me once, and Potter was able to fight him off. I have made werewolves a particular study of mine. I know 7 spells to kill a werewolf. Your brother was not in any danger, and I will not have you questioning me again. Percy blinks at the revelations in this sentence, but oddly the only thing he can focus on is, so you owe Harry's father a life debt. Percy shivers at the look of rage that twists Snape's face. No wonder the man hates Harry so much. I'm sorry, Percy hastens to say. That must be difficult for you to bear. This, to Percy's surprise, forestalls what he had been sure would be a torrential outburst. Instead, Snape takes several breaths and visibly tucks away his anger. Indeed, Percy had meant to come in here and admonish Snape, but now his courage deserts him in the face of Snape's rage. Instead, he only sighs. Well, it's all started now. Yes, and you are to leave Hogwarts in no more than a month. Percy sighs again. Now that the time has come to leave the castle, he finds himself lingering in warm corners, growing sentimental over his favorite alcove or the books that adorn the shelves near his table in the library. His partnership with Snape, while entirely unexpected, is strangely no less important to him than his association with McGonagall. It's been nearly 14 years in the castle, a thought which never fails to make him feel old and weary. His stomach is queasy. To distract himself, he asks, how did Black escape the grounds? I am not sure, but I believe Albus had something to do with it, Snape says with a sigh. A broom was reported missing from the student stores, and despite what many of the first years think, it is no trivial task to steal school property without alerting the heads of house. But I cannot be certain. Percy nods to himself thoughtfully. As usual, Dumbledore perhaps was waiting for Harry to act before stepping in himself, though he supposes that Black may have been able to dismantle the wards around the brooms if his magic was functional. One of the boys who made the map certainly would be able to steal a school broom. You must find the other Horcruxes, Snape says, watching him intently. I will focus on unraveling their mysteries. Percy swallows, but meets Snape's gaze. For 3 slow heartbeats, he hesitates, with the type of hesitation that can only underscore the knowledge that the words on the tip of his tongue, once uttered, can never be taken back, never be forgotten. I have an idea. Proceed. His hands are sweaty, dreadfully so, and he clenches his hands into fists inside the draping sleeves of his robes. First steps first, and then the second. In a rush, it all spills out. I think we should make a portrait of Tom. He sees Snape's eyebrow raise and hastens to add, with the diadem. You jest, surely, says Snape incredulously. That would never. Oh, I see. You've been planning this for a while, haven't you, Mr. Weasley? He's not been planning it, per se, but it would be lying to say that the idea hasn't been simmering inside him like a cauldron on the lowest flame, an intermittent bubble rising to the surface with the quietest of pops. Of course he'd had the idea, all those years ago, though he'd thought of perhaps using the diary as the sample of Tom. Percy is analytical and logical and sees opportunity where others merely falter. One could not expect him to research magical portraiture for nearly half a decade without considering there is at least one portrait it would be quite opportunistic to animate. Absolutely not, Snape says. I do not want to hear another second of this idea. The foundational theory is completely valid, Percy says quickly, feeling boneless with relief now that that idea has been released into the world to linger on another soul other than his. Portraits can be completed years after a death, using blood or skin or bone that is not fresh. I believe the Horcrux would qualify. And what would this process do to the diadem? Percy knows that Snape must be shocked to hear Percy's wild suggestion, but the other man seems to be controlling it well, asking his questions in a dry, clinical tone, as if Percy had come to him with nothing more than an outlandish research proposal. Well, I've completed some preliminary analysis, Professor, based on what we believe to be the constituent materials of the diadem, as well as its protective charms. Obviously, we do not know everything Lady Ravenclaw did to it, but I believe the recipe can be modified to take a base of goblin silver. Percy is ready with the parchment. Facing Snape is no different than preparing for an exam, and Percy is always prepared for an exam. Snape takes it and scans it mutely. Percy takes the opportunity to continue. It may not destroy the Horcrux, but rather allow it to transfer form, but we can still destroy it when the time comes. Tom would have been older when he made the diadem. Maybe it is the last he ever made. Portraits can't do magic, or even leave their frames if there are no other portraits with the same magical boundaries applied. He can tell us where to look. Snape seems to barely be listening, his eyes gleaming as he continues to scan the parchment. Percy knows that look, or can at least guess at it. They both know this idea may come to naught, but the idea of using magic in this way, potions and transfiguration and soul magic all inextricably combined, is incredibly appealing. I will look into it, Snape says abruptly. Your knowledge of transfiguration is sufficient. I believe so, sir, Percy says confidently. And your artistic abilities, Percy flushes. I am working on those. I see. There is a long pause. Percy shifts on his feet. It is likely this will come to nothing. He risks a smile. But you want to research it anyway. That you have the audacity to assume even the smallest of my intentions, Mr. Weasley, indicates what I have long suspected. Though it is apparent to all that you are rather dim, shockingly you seem to believe otherwise, Snape says dryly. But he's still looking at the parchment. Percy graduates. It's not as momentous as the first time around. Henry gives the speech instead of Percy. Though Percy does win an award for beating the previous record of owls and newts. Tom took one more newt, but Percy took another owl, and Tom only got an E in divination both times. Tonks is there, though, all three of them, and Charlie and Bill and his parents, and Aunt Muriel. Professor McGonagall tears up when she presents Percy with his diploma. Snape does not do any such thing, but a meaningful look passes between them nevertheless. Even Myrtle comes, shining in the brilliant sunlight, sitting next to Ginny on the end of the row. There's a frost between Aunt Muriel and his mother, particularly since Aunt Muriel insists on taking Percy to introduce him to the heads of several families, also in attendance as her new heir. And then his bags are packed, and once again he's leaving Hogwarts for the last time. He does not get as drunk as his classmates on their last night, though he does accept a drink, and he does go with Landon to the party, and he does smile as warmly as he can as Henry and Mariana and Alexander and all the rest recount their greatest hits, their best Quidditch wins, their hardest exams, their funniest memories that he was not included in. He takes an hour to walk around the castle himself, slowly and methodically, drinking in the sights and smells and sounds of Hogwarts. He'll need all of its strength to combat the coming months. It's an unsteady new world, and he has the Philosopher's Stone and Ravenclaw's diadem, and a burden that has grown no lighter over the years.